and the Queer Archive. This presentation was done for my class on the capital A archive, where we look at the archive, what got to be in it, and then what didn't. We also looked at the development of smaller archives, such as the Queer Archive. Archiving is just super historical, and the fact that we're looking at it in a literature class served to analyze, what is brought into the canon, because the literary canon is largely comprised of things that also slot neatly into the capital A archive. And that tends to be white, that tends to be straight, it tends to be male. So our class focused on deconstructing archive and creating our own archival material, our own documents, and analyzing others. So this presentation, which focuses primarily on the Queer Archive and a little bit on Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, was the first part of a discussion that I facilitated on the book as an archive on its own. I chose to focus on Valerie Roy's In the Queer Archive Fun Home for the brunt of this, and have attached a copy of the PDF for you guys to read. This PowerPoint will also be included for you guys, my awesome patrons, if you want to look at it and click the links, because I can't click out of the links in this without messing up my PowerPoint. To quote Roy, an archive is any mechanism for collecting and preserving information, including documents, computer data, audio recordings, objects, and historical artifacts. The Queer Archive exists in the public and the private, mixing content from these spaces in order to tell the stories of lives long lived and long lost. They are quote-unquote recovery projects. In Archival, Charles Morris writes that queer archives show us how queer lives, past and present, are constituted by voices that swell with the complex measure of our joys and our struggles against annihilating silence. Judith Halberstam, in A Queer Time and Space, calls the Queer Archive not simply a repository. It is also a theory of cultural relevance, a construction of collective memory, and a complex record of queer activity. In order for the archive to function, it requires users, interpreters, and cultural historians to wade through the material and piece together the jigsaw puzzle of queer history in the making. Additionally, the Queer Archive constructs a narrative of a changing queer experience over time. The Queer Archive provides knowledge on what it was like to be queer at any given time or place, considering what we know about the capital A archive, the structural archive, and its whiteness, its maleness. The many archival spaces for this archive are white, are focused on this queer male experience. Um, I'll get into a couple of other archives later, but this also, by the way, ties into fan studies and the archive of our own, in that it's an archive, and yes, anybody can put whatever they want on it. But think about the fact that white men are the highest represented group on Archive of Our Own in terms of characters and fan works. Like, think about that. It's a capital A archive, it's a structural force, and it plays right into dominant narratives about who gets to be represented. White guys. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about Svetkovich. I think her name is Anne Svetkovich, An Archive of Feeling Trauma. She writes that gay and lesbian history even exists has been a contested fact, and the struggle to record and preserve it is exacerbated by the invisibility that often surrounds intimate life, especially sexuality. Even the relatively short history, roughly quote unquote 100 years, of homosexuality as an identity category has created the historiographical challenge of not only documenting the wide varieties of homosexual experience, but examining documents of homophobia along with earlier histories of homoeroticism and same-sex relations. Right now, the queer archive as we know it tends to be incomplete because of the history of queerness around the world. And homophobia. It's not safe to be queer openly in many places around the world, and historically, especially once the West got involved, it was not usually safe to be queer. Um, Not much about queerness or queer lives from queer people was documented, and historically, additionally, you had sensitive material such as pornography, love letters between your queer friend group, they were destroyed upon the death of the owner. So there were clearly and obviously queer people living in these times and places that don't have or a typical queer archive, but because of societal standards and awful morality and period typical homophobia, we lost a lot of queer artifacts at death, essentially, for some of these people. And historians, queer historians, have been putting together pieces. Queer theory, queer studies, queer literature all serve to rebuild the archive and disseminate it among audiences, typically queer young people. The queer archive isn't just about collecting material or connecting material, it's about rebuilding and reconstructing this perception of what it was like to be queer, what it was like to be a queer person of color during the Harlem Renaissance. That's something that the Queer Archive would be foundational in if, it focused on queer people of color more. As a capital A archive, there are smaller non-capital A archives that do focus on the experiences of people of color, but they're not as mainstream. So there are literal queer archives, spaces that you can go into and interact with that are physical archives, like libraries. There's the Lesbian Her Story archives, which is in New York. When I post this, you guys can click this link. It's the world's largest collection of materials by and about lesbians and their communities. I found an entire thing about Harlem, I think, or Black lesbians in this archive. They have some files that are digital, most aren't, or digitized, and most aren't, which is terrible, but I'll live. It's a life goal to go visit it because I want to see some of their collections. Then there's the Irish Queer Archive, which is in Ireland and has collected material about a queer and Irish identity for over 40 years. This is something that has been like weirdly interesting to me for like 5 years. The simultaneous queer and Irish identity and nationalism in queer communities in Ireland, which is a thing you can actually like look at. And I feel like the Irish Queer Archive is a really good place to start for that. And also included a link. They don't seem to have a website, but they do have a Facebook page, which is not a website. But you can click through to that. They do have archival material that has been really interesting, news articles that are digitized. It's cool. So, what do these archives contain? Letters, love letters, personal letters, coming out letters, books. You have not just like poetry, you have chapbooks, you have romance novels, some of which these people wrote as part of their archives. You have the recordings of queer people. There's audio and video on the Lesbian Her Story website that you can look at. Posters for events, but also for movies, for protesting, event advertisements, dances. You have the protest signs, the actual protest signs that were used in protesting the horrible reaction or non-reaction to queer people dying of AIDS. You have protest signs for marriage rights, for marriage equality, for adoption. These are in these capital A archives, but also the literal archive spaces. And you also have material made up of other people's archives. So like if I ever become like really famous and like I guess I will donate my stuff to some kind of archive. I don't know who'd want my stuff, but they'd have to be very queer about it. Um, and what's really interesting is that in terms of archiving, right, the queer archivist is both a queer person and an archivist. You know, your identity and career are inextricably linked. We're collectors, we're fans of our own identities and histories. It's like how fandom it's like adjacent to fan studies, except it's literally your identity. You're collecting and documenting queerness and queer history because there's no one else that will. And so the materials that other archives, that giant museums or the Library of Congress might not be interested in, you are. As a queer archivist, you are. And that's pretty important. Here are some examples of things from the Lesbian Her Story collections that are in their archives. So on the left is a cover of a lesbian pulp novel. Lesbian pulp novels were a pretty big hit, uh, maybe in the 20s, 30s, 40s, around the same time as the regular pulps. I mean, not regular, because that's super weirdly heteronormative of me, but as the crime pulps, as The Shadow, The Spider, these were happening at the same time. You had these novels about queer desire. Some of them had happy endings for a while, and then they stopped and they didn't have happy endings, you know, or they snuck them in to market to queer women. These were primarily in the early days marketed to queer women in the same way that the gay male pulps were marketed towards queer men. Um, Top middle is a photograph of bisexual female activists. Oh, bottom protesting. This is from the Irish Archive. Out of our way, Irish queer and fighting is the main sign that you're seeing, and that's just cool. And then on the right is they have an Audrey Lorde collection, and I mean, I think she's one of the only black lesbians many people know. We'll work on them with that. But Audre Lorde, she's a collection. It used to be a traveling collection. Currently it's not, and I don't know why. But it looks, I guess it has lots of her papers. It looks at her writing in the context of her queerness as a lesbian. It's pretty neat. It's pretty neat. And that's her as maybe like a teenager. Adorable. So, who are these archives for? I've already brought up the idea of the queer archivist, and that's a thing. So, historians, duh. Of course, these archives are for historians. They're also for queer people who are searching for themselves. These are people who become historians and archivists because they're looking for themselves, looking for self. So Anne Svetkovich, her queer archivist resembles the fan or collector whose attachment to objects is often fetishistic, idiosyncratic, or obsessional. Of course, I disagree with her take on the archivist as obsessed or fetishistic because that others the queer archivists. It removes them from their right to memorialize their history and their identity. Queer archivists aren't fetishizing their identity. What kind of like crap is this? You you can fetishize other people's identity, but I don't think going, wow, I just found this poetry by Audre Lorde and it speaks to me. I need to like figure out what queer women talked about back in 1922. That's not fetishistic. And I mean, I've read the whole quote where this is from, and it literally doesn't make sense to describe uh, the queer archivist as essentially a stalker fan. You know, like I view this archive as a place, I view the queer archive as a place where queer people that they use when looking to find themselves. This quote, which I do not remember where I got it from, which is bad, um, says that the archive becomes a place where queer people use when seeking to locate their experiences, of oppression, but also of community building and the formation of productive counterpublics in particular socio-political circumstances. I mean, the archive tends to be really concerned with oppression because that's a lot of what queer experience has been connected to. Queer oppression, queer suffering, queer activism, violence against queer people. It's a lot. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that when a lot of queer people go looking for archive, looking for self in the archive, that what they tend to come across is really upsetting. So next we're going to talk about Alison Bechdel. So this is just a bit of background for Bechdel. So she was born September 10th, 1960. She was a lesbian who came out at age 19. Her work was cartoonist, primarily centered on queer experience and autobiographical work. She's been active since the 80s, following attending Oberlin College. And this is a quote from an interview she did, I think, in the 90s, where she says that the secret subversive goal of my work is to show that women, not just lesbians, are regular human beings. So her first major comic, this is prior to Fun Home, is Dykes to Watch Out For. And I mean, this is a pretty formative work for many queer women. And I say queer women, not just lesbians, because the comic, actually queer people, because the comic includes queer people of different identities. So it had ran for hundreds of strips up until 2008. It actually got a special post-election revival last year following Trump's election. It's not necessarily autobiographical because it's about the experiences of women in a group of friends primarily. It's like the L word, but not focused on thin, conventionally attractive white women who are all awful. So it does primarily center lesbians and other queer people, but you know what it does? What it did? It pushed back against trans exclusionary feminism from like like decades ago. Like what? And I love it. So this strip is also where you get the Bechdel Wallace test, which has nothing to do with the queer archive, but I just really like talking about the Bechdel Wallace test. In the strip, you see two characters talking about movies. So the character in the dark tank top goes, well, I don't know. I have this rule, see? I only go to a movie if it satisfies three basic requirements. One, it has to have at least two women in it, who, two, talk to each other about three, something besides a man. Her friend goes, pretty strict, but a good idea. And she responds, no kidding. Last movie I was able to see was Alien. And I love the Bechdel-Wallace test in general, but I love it here because this is it's from the source. It's literally the source. As the Bechdel test is used in 2017, going on 18, it's as a way to denote quality of a film. It's not intersectional. They're using it as a standard. So um, Pacific Rim fails the Bechdel test because, the one main female character doesn't talk to any women about dudes, about anything other than, well, I don't think she talks to any other women, right? But then um, a show like Girls would pass it, despite the fact that it's like really racist. So there's no accounting for intersectionality. And the thing is, though, is that that's not how the test was conceived. It was about going to see a movie, consuming media. So if we all took up with the Bechdel test as it's presented in this page, we would basically never watch movies that were made in the US, basically. Like, the US is kind of terrible about having women speak to each other about things that aren't dudes. Thanks, Hollywood. All right, now that I'm done complaining about that, let's talk a little bit about Fun Home. So, Fun Home, a family tragicomic, first published in 2006. I was in high school. It won approximately all of the awards, including an Eisner, which I think is cool. It's a non-linear narrative, labyrinthian, it doubles back, it makes points that it's already made, it clarifies, it obscures things from before. It's full of revisited memories that create a story about two generations of queer Bechdels. And I love it. So, Fun Home as a historical queer archive. So on page 343 slash 344 of Roy's work, she poses the question that because of the legacy of the closet, queer literature is dominated by autobiography and is rooted in personal testimony. So Roy views Fun Home as a private collection that's open to the public. Entries and objects are presented in the same way that artifacts in a museum are, with photographs and documents, such as police reports, painstakingly reproduced. So Bechdel describes herself as an archivist in this context. She's archiving her family's queer history. And she's doing all of this archival work, reproducing the documents, the police report I mentioned of her father trying to pick up a teenager at a bar. You know, she documents the photographs she found that her father kept. Her father's a freaking creep. And that's something that I'll save if I ever do my analysis of Fun Home for you guys, because Fun Home, while it is one of my favorite queer pieces of media, and it's definitely important to queer archiving and the formulation of a queer canon, has some problems that Bechdel doesn't engage with. And one of the problems is that her father seems to be a serial predator. And that's weird that she doesn't address that. Anyway, so while Fun Home itself is an archive, right? It's displaying the stuff of family history. Its narrative contains other archives, each with its own relation to meaning, history, and identity. This also comes from Roy, by the way. There's the museum-like house, the father's home library, Bechdel's childhood diary, and the public libraries that she frequents as an adult. So it's archive within archive, like a puzzle box. It's really cool. Um, so at this point, this was where my professor was like, "Are you going to ask questions now?" And I'm not going to ask you guys questions. I facilitated then a 40, because this was like, when I did it in class, this stretched out to like 40 minutes because I had to do, of course, anecdotes about my queerness in the context of the queer archive, and I was able to click out to show the examples. And then I went on to have my classmates analyze the material within Fun Home, which was pretty cool. At the end of the day, the queer archive is like any other archive in terms of gatekeeping, in terms of trying to make it accessible for people. And I think that it applies to what I do in terms of fan studies, which looks at history, it looks at representation. I think that it's really important to look at the queer archive both as a necessary tool and as something that, in trying to make space for queer people, also kind of erases some queer people. Or because, like, how many queer black women have the opportunities that Bechdel had in making Fun Home? You know, how many trans cartoonists, and there are trans cartoonists, how many of them had the opportunity to tell their story in this way, in this format? You know, how many queer people get to be in the capital A archive? Even the queer archive with its own capital letters. It's interesting and frustrating.